joined by Sideline Analyst and also writes a lot about West Virginia, analyst for them. Jed Drenning joins us, our go-to guy with the Mountaineers. Jed, did they make the right decision, and did they do it at the right time?
I think at this juncture it was probably a necessary decision. In large measure, sometimes these things come down to energizing the fan base, and the fan base wants an opportunity to be competitive. And it's not as though we were a bad football team for the last 5 years. We've just been a serviceable, middle-of-the-pack football team. And that's not what West Virginia fans anticipate. Now, you could argue there's been some hardship that needed to be overcome, and we just weren't able to overcome it. But, we're trying to work our way coming out of this NIL deficit and things of that nature. And I do think that some of that is in sight. Some progress is in sight. So whoever takes the job next might find themselves gradually in more competitive surroundings on that front. And that's where everything's been working for the last couple of years, is trying to get that right. We got the trust in order. So the roster attrition wasn't what it was a handful of years ago. That was somewhat stabilized. You wanted to do everything you could to give Neal Brown and the staff a legitimate puncher's chance to be competitive. And so as we did those things, this was a football team that just couldn't get over the hump. Again, not a bad team. We hovered around 500. We won 9 games last year, by and large competitive until the season finale this year. Is just against those better teams on the schedule and in the Big 12, we kept finding ways to let it slip away in the late going, whether it was the Kansas State game because we were banged up in the second half, the Iowa State game, who made plays against us in the fourth quarter that we didn't make. We kept finding ways to drop those games that could have helped us continue moving up instead of down. And I think as a result, at this juncture, they decided, look, now's the time to make the change. You're going into this rev share deal next year where everything's kind of reinvented yet again. So this is probably the optimal time to try and do that.
Jed, I was just curious, if that Texas Tech game goes differently, do you think the decision is still made, or was that kind of the straw that broke the camel's back to fashion in which they lost that game?
You could definitely argue that. You could definitely argue that because, again, when you look at the nature of how this season has gone, we were picked to finish 7th in the Big 12. Obviously, it didn't turn out that way. But if you win that football game, you're at 7-5 with some tough losses against some really good teams, potentially on your way to an 8th win in the bowl game. So you could find yourself with 9 wins last year, 8 wins this year. You could say that potentially that might be enough to buy you another year and get into this rev share era. But that didn't happen. Matter of fact, quite the opposite happened. And by halftime, the thing was well decided at 35-3. We took their best shot. It wasn't a great matchup for us to begin with. Our greatest shortcoming or weakness or limitation on the back end defensively, their greatest strength is the ability to get Taj Brooks slathered up and throw the football off of that. And they just cut us apart. And so this was probably the least optimal scenario for Neal to have any kind of chance to advance, is ending the season in the nature that we did.
Jed, do you think that given the comment that Neal Brown made about having fun at the game and, again, being mediocre this year, completely average, that it was just going to be too tough of a sell, too, as well for Ren Baker?
Well, it reached a point where that was wildly misconstrued, but it was misconstrued because of the nature of the environment that had been created by that point. Mm-hmm. In other words, it reaches a point where people are looking to tear apart everything you say, to take a quote and run with it out of context or otherwise. And when you create that kind of environment, you find yourself at 500 when people expect a whole lot more. Those types of things are going to happen. If you're sitting there at 7-2 and he says that, people would understand what he meant. It was a great environment. It was a blackout. We never wore black uniforms. We honored the coal miners. That's what he intended. Now, he could have said it more judiciously, but again, when you're struggling and you say those types of things, they're going to be scrutinized greatly. And I think at the end of the day, that was yet another game. That Iowa State team was ranked, and we played them tough for 3+ quarters, but it wasn't enough, and they separated late, whereas we didn't. And when you look at what Neal did against ranked teams, 3-17 isn't good enough. I mean, traditionally, West Virginia, it's not like we're winning 70% of our games in the history of our program against ranked teams. No, traditionally, throughout the course of our history, we've won 27, 28% against ranked teams. Don Nealon was right in that 27, 28% area. So we're used to winning roughly 1 and 4 against those premier teams, and winning 1 out of 6 or 1 out of 7 is not enough to be competitive and to go on a run and get things to the point that you want to get them moving forward. But, the program at large is wildly stable from in the building. But when you're not winning the games and that's not translating on the field, that doesn't matter. Now, it's good news for whoever he hands the baton to, because it's a very stable baton. I mean, all the types of things that sometimes can be rough around the corners and lead to these types of problems, that's not been the case at all. I mean, I've said many times this season, we've faced a lot of adversity, self-inflicted and otherwise. And I've been or seen so many locker rooms that could come apart at the seams and turn on each other, going through this level of turmoil and this level of heat. This locker room didn't do that. And that speaks to the culture and the types of kids that are populating that locker room. But we just, again, at the end of the day, couldn't win enough of those close games to be more than a 500 team.
Was there anything in particular Neal Brown could have done differently?
That's a good question. I think one of the setbacks that played out, and this was early on, he brought with him, when he brought his staff, he brought Vic Koenig as D coordinator, and Neal was kind of a global coach in the sense that he looks at the game big picture. He thinks all three dimensions of the game are interconnected. He's old school in that sense. And so he leaned on Vic Koenig during his time at Troy as a very trusted partner to run the defensive side of the football. And he came into West Virginia with him in 2019, and there were off-the-field circumstances that forced him out. So all of a sudden, you're left shuffling, and you need to find a new D coordinator, not the guy you took the job with. So he hired within. He promoted Jordan Leslie on staff. Initially, that worked out, but over the course of time, the personnel didn't necessarily fit. We guessed wrong in some of those portal acquisitions, and some of that caught up with us. And so this past season, he was forced to make another change, kind of under fire in the middle of the season. And Jordan was sent on his way 3 games ago, and in came Jeff Coons, and that wasn't working out either. But part of that was, of course, personnel. But I do wonder if Vic Koenig had been retained throughout the duration of this. That was such a critical part of his success at Troy. I think there would have been an element of stability on that side of the ball. I'm not saying there were wild deficiencies with who we had, but that was a major change. We managed to turn around our run game, which was historically poor that first year, by building through the offensive line. And at the end of the day, guys, we weren't explosive enough offensively to bail out a sagging defense, and that's just not going to work. So maybe if you could have guessed right from a personnel standpoint on the defensive side with a couple guys that you otherwise didn't. We hit on some of those guys this past year, but we didn't hit on enough. And maybe that's what could be different.
Jed, do you have a style of coach, at least, maybe not a specific name, but someone who fits, who can hit the ground running there?
Well, I think the cultural piece you want to continue with. You need a solid culture at West Virginia. It's a tight-knit program. And when it's humming and firing on all cylinders, it's very close to the fan base. But I also think you need an innovator. When we've been at our best, it's in large measure somebody doing something against the grain that nobody else is willing or inclined to do, which compensates for some of our limitations or shortcomings in resources. You make it up on the X's and O's side from a creativity standpoint. Now, that doesn't grow on trees. Everybody's looking for it. But for instance, when you look back at what Rich Rod did, in large measure, it was because of that. He plugged in talent that fit something in a power spread offense that nobody else was doing from a tempo standpoint. He was running an odd stack before anybody else was doing it. We were going rugby punt before anybody else was doing it. And some of the same things that Coach Neal was trying when he brought in Major Harris when nobody else was doing those types of things. With a quarterback like Major Harris back in the late 80s, you were typically running an option offense. Well, we were more pro style with the athletic Major Harris. Not a lot of teams are doing that. So when you look back historically at the types of things we were doing, whether it was Dana Holgerson's version of the air raid, it's always been somewhat different and innovative. And so I would think that would be a critical piece of whoever the next head coach at West Virginia is. And then, of course, you're going to have to be able to manage the modern roster, which means you have to be somewhat transactional as well. You have to understand your place in terms of fitting the pieces together in these ever-revolving doors that we're now handed from a roster management standpoint. I mean, there's some critical timelines, guys, as you know, coming up here in December. Not just with the portal, but with National Signing Day this week. I mean, some of those kids have said, look, our commitment's still there, but not maybe as firm. We're going to open it up to other possibilities between now and Wednesday. Others have said we're going to forge ahead. We'll see how that works out with who we get. But then from a roster retention standpoint, there's going to be pieces that you want to keep. So it's critical to get the next guy in the building quickly so he can do his own evaluation, determine who he does want to keep, and then jump into the portal, because that window opens up the 9th, and it varies depending on whether or not you're in the bowl or the playoffs. But you better get humming on that very quickly, because your starting point is going to be the roster you end December with, and then you got to go into the spring and go from there.
Jed, did I hear you mention Rich Rod?
What we're talking about when Rich was here,
right?
Yeah, a big part of his success.
Do you think that a former West Virginia head coach, and I know Dana Holgerson's now with Nebraska, and I know that ended sour. Is there any thought that a former coach that was there might be in the mix for this time?
It's hard to say. I mean, I do know that Wren is a very thorough guy. He's 3 for 3 with what looked like, at least at this early stage, 3 slam dunk hires that he's made since taking this job. Jen Greeny on the volleyball front, Mark Kellogg on the women's hoops front, and then, of course, Darian DeVries. Darren's done a great job with the men's basketball program. The first handful of games through, a couple ranked wins over the weekend. But so he has a track record, even back to North Texas, of making very solid hires. And that doesn't happen when you're not thorough and you're not patient and you don't vet. And he is obviously going to do all those things, start with a large list, whittle it down to a more realistic list, and find what's absolutely, in his estimation, the best fit. And based on his track record, I fully trust his judgment. He's done a great job of diving in and embracing the culture and learning to understand it, because it's a different animal here in West Virginia. I mean, it's one of only a couple states that there's no other pro team, and we're the biggest show in town. You got Marshall down the road as a G5, but West Virginia is what stirs the drink. I mean, it's the straw that stirs the drink in this state. That flying WV, you can't go anywhere in any corner of the state and travel more than 2 minutes without seeing somebody wearing a flying WV logo, and I'm not exaggerating whatsoever. So it's very meaningful to the people here. And in that sense, you have to embrace that. And that's something Wren's done. And he's come to understand that. And I think he knows the type of fit that it takes to win and the type of fit it takes to resonate with the fan base as well. So I trust him to do the right thing in terms of whatever his choice turns out to be. But these things, you know, they happen for reasons. And even when you look at rivalry games, I mean, Neal, in 3 years, I firmly believe that in 3 games against Pitt, we've outplayed them 3 times, yet we have 1 win to show for it. And those types of things tend to catch up to you. And, I mean, at the end of the day, this is just stacking all the wrong pennies that end up working against you. And it's not as though we weren't competitive. It's not as though we were getting blown out and winning 3 games a year, okay? We were competitive, just not competitive enough. And we weren't finding enough ways to win enough of those big games. Again, in the history of West Virginia, you're not supposed to dominate those games, but you do have to find your way to win your share of them. And traditionally, that's in that 27% or so mark. And if you can exceed that, even better. We couldn't get to that. And that's all leading us where we are today.
Hey, man, you always do a great job. We'll be back in touch with you once they make a decision, whenever that might be. Hell of a basketball team. We look forward to that. Can't wait to talk to you again. Thanks for your time.
And I will say one more thing, Smokey, to your
sir.
audience down in Waco. Well, I wish a lot of those folks would have got their way and they'd have fired Dave Aranda. I truly wish that. But, I really wish that would have happened.
Yeah.
But, unfortunately, it didn't for the rest of us. So.
No, yeah, that's amazing, because at this time a year ago, I mean, that was absolutely on the table, and Mac Brown's figured out, okay. And then what I also like about what they did, and I don't think Neal Brown was going to be in this position, Mac said to Dave, what do you need to be successful going forward? And they worked it out. They've strengthened some things, and here they are. Doesn't mean next year's going to be all, sweet and good, but Man, they did turn it around, especially
Well,
after a 2-4 start.
I talked briefly to Jake, the Spav, after the game, and I said, look, it's reached the point now, and what I told him then, I believe even more firmly now, a couple weeks later, offensively, they're playing the best football in the Big 12 and among the best football in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And, as a team, I might even say that. I don't know if anybody in this league would want to touch them right now. I really don't. Good for Dave, good for Jake. They got that thing rolling. They're good people down there.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it. Jed Drenning, West Virginia Sideline Analyst, but also you can find him on Twitter at The Signal Caller, and he does have a newsletter, a preview magazine that he puts out that is absolutely incredible with history